Hello. So today I'm going to talk about bad faith in politics. So among politicians and in politics in media, like news media and opinion shows and think tanks and whatever other areas of politics that there are. And I'm going to talk about how bad faith, well, it can be discovered, it can be uncovered by democratic institutions, but we need to be aware that we're looking for it. So, for example, when Fox News was sued, like Tucker Carlson and others on Fox News were sued, in the court cases, they admitted that it was not truth that they were speaking. And they actually used it as a defense, saying, oh, nobody should take Tucker Carlson seriously. And they won on that ground, on those grounds. But they're also being sued now and about the Dominion voting machines. And again, it's democratic institutions like the courts that can help to reveal truth and uncover people who are acting with bad faith, with lies. But there's other kinds of bad faith than just lies. And so there's a lot to talk about here. I'll see how much of it I can get to in this video. I might have to continue the video, part 2, maybe 3, 4. We'll see. So the worst bad faith actors are actually trying to undermine those institutions, right? So either it's because they know that those institutions are going to reveal them and they were actively doing it for that reason, or many of them are doing it just because they can profit from it. Undermining institutions makes people money. They're doing that all day long on Fox News. So if any of these people are undermining institutions on purpose, they're doing it to essentially to prepare America. We're talking about America here primarily, although it is happening in the UK as well, I think. But if they're doing it on purpose, we call that active measures. They're trying to undermine the institutions in order to pave the way for a takeover, essentially, or a twisting of the system into a different system, such as an authoritarian system, because that is really what it opens the door to. And it could be fascism in particular, because that thrives on division. Or they're trying to just create enough chaos that an authoritarian of whatever stripe can take over. So some on the right are worried that people on the left are doing it, and there may be some. It's definitely true, but it seems like the right wing, especially in the Trump era, was winning, was more powerful and dangerous. So we don't know if people are doing it just for their personal profit or whether some of them, I'm sure it's not all of them, but a select few may be doing it with full knowledge of what they're actually trying to do. And the way that they do this is to create division, to lie, to get people to not know what is true, to divide so that part of the country believes mostly lies and disinformation. And they use the twisting of language, and Tucker Carlson is genius at this, to include the kinds of things that trigger people's emotions, division and hate and jealousy. And they also use flattery and framing, obviously, things with a grain of truth. And framing is something that Tucker Carlson is very good at. And he uses flattery of his audience as well. There are videos that go into a lot of detail on how Tucker does this, the way that he is like a propaganda outlet and very masterful at it. And he makes you feel smart, and you think that he's an expert that you would believe, even though he teaches you to not believe in experts. Anyway, we can see examples in the past of how people have used this twisting of language. For example, the Bolsheviks, once they came into power, used language very powerfully. Their propaganda is well known. But even before they came to power, they knew how to use slogans that weren't even true. Peace, land, and bread, they said, even though land, the way that peasants believed that to be, would be that they would get to own their own land when previously they had been serfs under a feudal landowner. But the Bolsheviks were never going to give peasants their own land unless, and they wouldn't have believed, wouldn't have thought of it this way, but unless you believe that communal land ownership is still land ownership, the peasants did not believe that. So the Bolsheviks knew how to craft slogans that would get people on their side, although it was still a coup and they didn't have many people on their side. But there was chaos created, and that chaos was primarily created by World War I and by a weak czar that had lost the faith of the people. And there had been a previous 1905 revolution and so on. And it was this convergence of things, and then a very weak original provisional government, which would have been democratic and would have been, not perfect, but something that could evolve into a good, strong, proper democracy. But they were very weak and they wanted to continue fighting the war. So with the czar out of power and a very weak provisional government and a war and a lot of, people not wanting to keep fighting the war because a lot of death and a lot of poverty, a lot of famine, created that chaos that was needed, and then they could take over in a coup. So that's the kind of thing that Active Measures is looking to do, is to create that kind of chaos, that kind of lack of faith in institutions, the way that people didn't have faith in the provisional government and the institutions that they were trying to create. So as I say, the real mastery of language in use to change the minds of the people came after they took power, and they used it to get people, all of the people, to think like Marxists. And of course, they had to force them into this. They used coercion, but they also just flooded, they got rid of any private papers and other private, sources of media, and they decided what books people could read. And when, they had television, they used that to their advantage, and you could only watch things that were Marxist, but they also taught it in schools, and they did it everywhere. And so they changed the way that people thought, even though some people certainly didn't believe it, and especially when things kept going wrong and they kept not getting the utopia that they were promised, they became cynical. And this cynicism during the communist era, which grew and grew over the decades, it required people to hold two things in their mind at once, because they still had to pretend to be communist. And this just added to this kind of cognitive dissonance and cynicism and post-truth society, which really, once communism crumbled, that's when the post-truth world really came out, because they tried to have democracy for a while, but it quickly got undermined, and then Putin stepped in. He was a KGB guy. He knew how to use active measures. So we don't know exactly, but he may well have undermined the attempt at democracy that happened. And, we really we won't know, but we do know how Putin took advantage of the chaos and the cynicism and the post-truth era that was beginning because of the crumbling of communism and then the failure of democracy to take hold with the inequality after the privatizations, the oligarchs' rise, and so on. So now we know that Putin understood active measures, and the disinformation campaign that Russia has been doing in America and the UK is very likely an example of it. So whether he did it in Russia or he just took advantage of something and created and stoked this post-truth society in Russia, now he's exporting it to America, to the UK, through disinformation campaigns, through undermining of institutions in America and the UK. And this is also possibly being done by, actual citizens of the United States and the UK. Let's focus on the United States. Or they might be doing it by accident, just because it can be very profitable, and going along with Russian disinformation and creating their own and spreading their own disinformation can be very profitable, because they're trying to give people what they want to hear. They're stoking divisions, emotions, things that they can use to get under people's skin or to get inside their hearts and minds and emotions. And that's much more powerful, politicians have known for a long time, than sort of just a dry, factual analysis. And if you don't care about bringing people real, factual analysis, you will just do what's easy and fun and cheap and gets people excited and gets many millions of viewers. And that's what you get from people, whether they're trying to undermine anything or whether they're just making money. That's what you get on, for example, Fox News. And especially, obviously, in their opinion shows, in shows like Tucker Carlson, and on right-wing radio. And again, not to say that this can't be happening on the left as well, but it certainly, especially during the Trump era, was very much more powerful on the right. But now I want to talk about something other than lies and other than trying to stoke the kinds of division and things that is used by active measures. I want to talk about another specific thing that's happening on the right, and that is white supremacist. I want to talk about smuggling in an idea or an ideology. This is through dog whistles, and this is through framing, and this is through all kinds of techniques. They're smuggling one ideology inside another, like a Trojan horse. And that is definitely the work of a bad faith actor. But when they're doing it in this sophisticated way that you see, especially on Tucker Carlson, and that many politicians who call themselves, say, libertarian or populist, that they're doing it on purpose. And it turns out that bad faith politicians have long used libertarian ideology. The most obvious way that they've used it is essentially to give handouts to big corporations, but under the pretense of we shouldn't overtax them and we should, believe in the free market and so on, even while they actually are giving them subsidies or giving them tax favors, favoring one corporation over another, and doing it in response to lobbying, which is anything but libertarian. But what I'm more interested in is the bad faith actors who are using it for something more sinister. In particular, smuggling in a white supremacist ideology in the guise of libertarianism. And I have found this not just among politicians, but among academics and in the news media and journalism. Now, recently, the white supremacist ideology has been found in populist rhetoric and supposed ideology. So you might wonder about the libertarian ideology, the use of the libertarian ideology to smuggle it in. But I'm going to give you a bunch of examples because people tie it to populism and nationalism, and that is where it ends up. But it actually started out being smuggled in through libertarianism, as I said, in multiple areas, including academia. When one first gets into libertarianism and is seeking out others, one often finds sites and people who espouse certain libertarian ideas, particularly the free market, lower taxes, and less regulation. And then, as they continue reading up on the person or the think tank, they find that they're anti-immigration and sometimes even quite racist about it. But true libertarian ideology is very much pro-immigration. After all, the freedom of movement of people is as important as the freedom of trade, of movement of goods. That's the only way that one can have a flexible labor market and the ability for people to match jobs and to be able to trade freely. So how do you explain Nigel Farage and UKIP in the UK and the John Birch Society and many politicians and media figures in the US, including Ron Paul, who claims to be pro-immigration but is actually pretty anti-immigration compared to many Democrats? He has justifications, but they're quite ridiculous. Like, if you dare to give amnesty to people who have been living in America for decades, although they entered illegally, you undermine the rule of law. But this seems quite ridiculous, and most people agree that you can still be for rule of law across society, even if you make an exception for people who have spent decades in the country and merely entered illegally decades ago. And his hypocrisy, which I'm sure you can find exceptions that he has made to the rule of law or times when he undermined it in his own ways, and his priorities tell you something. It also isn't a coincidence, I'm sure, that he had a newsletter that ran for decades in which there was some pretty racist things in it. Libertarianism is a pretty consistent ideology, but the different libertarians have different priorities, which make how they define themselves as libertarian very inconsistent with each other. And so when we look at these priorities, we can learn a lot about why the person is libertarian and whether they really are libertarian or whether they're using it as a cloak. Libertarians and Austrian economists, who tend to be very free market, all say that they're against rent-seeking, picking winners, and the corruption of politicians through corporate money that seeks these rents and creating monopolies, but they're also against government social spending and redistribution. So which do they care about more? And this is the left libertarian versus right libertarian. Left libertarian caring about social freedoms and also wanting to reduce the tax loopholes and subsidies for corporations and reducing the corporate rents, and care less about merely lowering taxes, especially if they lower taxes for corporations or create loopholes or in some ways preference the corporations, whereas the right-leaning libertarians want to do that. They want to lower the corporate taxes, and they want to flatten tax rates, and they want to cut social spending. And of course the question of immigration, which again the left might prioritize more. The question is, how do they juggle all of these different priorities? And how does that then shake out into which political party they prefer? And so, despite the tariffs, the corruption and rent-seeking, the separation of children from their parents at the border, among other racist, unequal, and unconstitutional anti-immigration policies, and the undermining and abuse of just about every institution, just to name a few things that should horrify libertarians, many of them still voted for the GOP and for Trump over Biden and the Democrats, who, although they might increase government spending in some ways for individuals and for the low income, actually had quite a few rather libertarian policies and could be encouraged to have even more. But I have a separate two-part video series to discuss this. What I want to discuss here is why people would make that choice, and I think we have to realize the true danger that Trump represents as a populist, taking over from the real issue with the libertarian ideology being hijacked and people coming from a position of bad faith. What we need to see is that this issue of priorities is actually a big gaping hole in the libertarian ideology, and this hole happens to be the right size in which to smuggle a different ideology, like white supremacy or fascism. And that is what then allowed Trump and the populists to take over after libertarianism created the space for it by, among other things, undermining the desire to support government with taxes, and then that created poor governance and then the lack of faith in government and institutions. How was this helpful? How did this create the space for the populist and demagogue to take over? Well, for one thing, it's an active measures technique, undermine the institutions and create the chaos. And for another, it was paired with this smuggling in of white supremacy by undermining faith in the federal government and instead saying things should be decentralized. It was a return to states' rights when the federal government was the main protector ever since the Civil War of the rights of minorities, of civil rights and human rights and basic individual rights, which is what actually libertarianism is supposed to be all about. But I'm going to leave this video here and come back for part 2. Thanks for listening.